Story 1. The Visitor. Every town has its Halloween legends. In the small, remote town of Elwood, there was one that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. They called it the Visitor. It wasn't a ghost, a demon, or anything from folklore. It was something far worse. A person. Or at least, it appeared to be. The story dates back to the 1960s. Elwood was known for its tight-knit community and innocent Halloween festivities. Every year, kids would dress up in costumes, parade through the town, and collect candy from neighbors. The event was as wholesome as you'd expect in a small town. But everything changed in 1967. That year, on Halloween night, as families gathered to enjoy the town's annual festival, a stranger appeared. He was dressed as a scarecrow, his face covered with a burlap sack crudely stitched with black string, and his clothes were tattered and filthy. He stood in the shadows near the edge of the town square, watching. At first, people thought he was part of the Halloween festivities, someone who had taken the tradition of dressing up a bit too seriously. But there was something off about him. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched. As the night wore on, the townsfolk began to grow uneasy. The scarecrow figure wasn't mingling or trick-or-treating. When a group of kids approached him, excited to see what kind of candy he was giving out, he didn't react. He stood motionless, his hollow eyes seemingly fixed on the crowd. Then, without warning, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. People assumed he'd simply wandered off, but that wasn't the end of the story. The next morning, a family of 4 was found brutally murdered in their home on the outskirts of town. The children had been dressed in their Halloween costumes, their faces painted in the innocent joy of the night before, but their bodies lay cold and lifeless. The parents had been bound and tortured, their final moments filled with unspeakable horror. What made the discovery even more chilling was the burlap sack found at the scene, the same kind the scarecrow figure had worn. But there were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to indicate who had committed the atrocity. The town was in shock. The murders remained unsolved, and the scarecrow figure was never seen again. For years, the story of the Visitor became a ghost tale told to scare the children of Elwood. But every so often, someone would report seeing a strange figure standing in the shadows on Halloween night. No murders followed, but the fear lingered. Then, in 2017, 50 years after the murders, the scarecrow returned. Elwood had changed over the years, modernized like any small town, but the Halloween festival remained a cherished tradition. That year, as families gathered once more in the town square, a figure appeared. He wore the same burlap mask, the same tattered clothing, and he stood in the same spot as the scarecrow from the legend. This time people were wary. Some remembered the story of the Visitor, others dismissed it as urban legend. But as the night progressed, that feeling of unease returned. When the festival ended, the scarecrow disappeared again, just as suddenly as he had in 1967. The following morning, the news broke. Another family had been slaughtered. The details were eerily similar. The parents had been tortured, the children left lifeless in their costumes, and a burlap sack was found at the scene. Panic gripped the town, and the once beloved Halloween festival was canceled indefinitely. No one knew who or what the Visitor was. Some believed it was a curse, others thought it was a copycat killer. But no one ever saw the scarecrow again. To this day, the murders remain unsolved, and every Halloween night, the people of Elwood lock their doors and stay inside, fearing that the Visitor may one day return. Story 2. The Silent Trick-or-Treaters. It was Halloween 2004, and Ellen Gibson had just moved into a new neighborhood with her husband and 2 young children. Their house was on the edge of a cul-de-sac, in a quiet suburban area known for its safety and friendliness. This year, Ellen was excited to participate in the local Halloween festivities, having been informed that the neighborhood went all out with decorations and trick-or-treating. Ellen spent weeks decorating the house, setting up spider webs, gravestones, and a giant inflatable pumpkin on the lawn. When Halloween finally arrived, she and her husband dressed in matching vampire costumes, ready to hand out candy while their kids, a pirate and a fairy, went door to door with their friends. The night started off as expected. Children came in droves, their bags rustling as they eagerly collected candy from each house. Laughter and the sounds of excited chatter filled the air. Everything was going perfectly. Around 9 p.m., when most of the trick-or-treaters had returned home, Ellen noticed something odd. A group of children, 3 of them to be exact, stood silently at the end of her driveway. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at her house. At first, Ellen thought they were admiring the decorations, but after several minutes of them not moving, she grew uneasy. They were dressed in traditional costumes, a witch, a ghost, and a skeleton. But something was wrong. Their costumes were tattered and old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s, and their faces— Ellen couldn't quite place it, but they didn't look right. The glow from the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows behind them, making them appear unnaturally tall and thin. Her husband noticed too. "What's up with those kids?" he asked, peering through the window. "I don't know," Ellen replied. "They've been standing there for a while." "Maybe they're shy," he suggested. Ellen shrugged, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. After a few more minutes of watching them, Ellen decided to approach the kids. She grabbed the candy bowl and stepped outside. As she got closer, she noticed that they weren't holding bags for candy. "Happy Halloween," she called out, trying to sound cheerful. "Would you like some candy?" The children didn't respond. They just stood there, their eyes fixed on her, unblinking. She stopped a few feet away, the candy bowl clutched in her hands. "Do you need help? Are you lost?" Still, no response. Not a word, not a sound, just silence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was very wrong. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the strange children. When she reached her front door, she turned and hurried inside, locking it behind her. "What happened?" her husband asked, sensing her distress. "They didn't say anything," Ellen whispered, her voice trembling. "They just stared at me. They didn't even have candy bags." Her husband frowned. "That's weird. Maybe they're playing a prank." "Maybe," Ellen muttered. But deep down she didn't believe it. For the rest of the night, Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She checked the window several times, but the children were gone. She tried to forget about it, but the memory of their cold, vacant stares lingered. A few days later, Ellen was talking to her neighbor, Mrs. Andrews, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Ellen mentioned the strange trick-or-treaters, hoping to get some answers. Mrs. Andrews's face went pale. "Oh no," she whispered. "Not them." "What do you mean?" Ellen asked, her heart beginning to race. Mrs. Andrews hesitated, then sighed. "You're not the first to see them. Those children, they're not alive." Ellen's blood ran cold. "They died years ago," Mrs. Andrews continued. "Back in the 1950s. They were hit by a car while trick-or-treating on this very street. Every few years, on Halloween, they return. They stand at the edge of the driveway, waiting, watching." Ellen's stomach churned. "But why?" "No one knows," Mrs. Andrews said softly. "But once you see them, they'll be back." That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. She kept imagining those children standing at the end of her driveway, their hollow eyes staring into her soul. The following Halloween, she and her family went out of town, hoping to avoid the silent trick-or-treaters. But even after moving away years later, Ellen swears that every Halloween night she still feels their presence, waiting, watching, silently asking for something she can't give. Story 3. The Pumpkin Patch Man. In the rural town of Ashton, there was a local legend about a man who haunted the pumpkin patch just outside of town. Parents warned their children to never go there alone, especially at night, and to always stay away from the patch on Halloween. His name was never spoken, but everyone called him the Pumpkin Patch Man. The story began decades ago with a man named Jacob Harrow. Jacob had been the town's beloved pumpkin farmer. He was quiet, kind, and generous, always giving away his best pumpkins to the children for carving. But one Halloween night, something terrible happened. A group of local boys decided to pull a prank on Jacob. They snuck into his pumpkin patch in the dead of night, intending to steal a few pumpkins and smash them on his porch as a Halloween joke. But Jacob caught them. Enraged at the sight of his precious pumpkins being destroyed, he chased after the boys, brandishing a rusty old sickle he used for harvesting. The boys ran, terrified, but Jacob caught the youngest one, a 12-year-old named Tommy. In his fury, Jacob swung the sickle at the boy. It wasn't meant to be fatal, but in the darkness, Jacob misjudged his aim. The sickle cut deep into Tommy's throat, killing him instantly. Jacob, horrified by what he had done, dragged Tommy's body to the center of the pumpkin patch and buried him among the vines. When the other boys returned with the police, Jacob swore he had never seen Tommy, that he had only chased the boys away and they had run off. But the guilt consumed him. In the weeks that followed, Jacob's mental state deteriorated. He stopped tending his pumpkin patch, letting the pumpkins rot on the vine. He became reclusive, his once kind demeanor replaced by something darker. People said they could hear him at night, whispering to the pumpkins as if they were alive. Then, one Halloween night, Jacob disappeared. His house was found abandoned, the doors wide open, and the only clue to his whereabouts was a single, freshly carved jack-o'-lantern left on his porch. Some believed Jacob had gone mad and wandered into the woods to die. Others believed something more sinister had happened, that the spirit of Tommy had returned to take his revenge. For years, the pumpkin patch lay abandoned, the vines withering, and the town moved on. But every Halloween, a strange phenomenon began to occur. People reported seeing a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the pumpkin patch, watching anyone who dared come near. The figure was tall and thin, his face hidden beneath a grotesque jack-o'-lantern mask. His clothes were ragged, and he carried a sickle in his hand. Those who saw him called him the Pumpkin Patch Man. Over time, the legend grew. Some said that if you ventured into the patch on Halloween night, the Pumpkin Patch Man would appear, and you'd never be seen again. Others claimed that he was waiting for someone to take his place, to become the new guardian of the cursed patch. Despite the warnings, teenagers from Ashton would dare each other to visit the patch on Halloween. Most returned unscathed, laughing off the legend as a ghost story. But in 1996, a group of 4 teenagers went missing after venturing into the pumpkin patch on a dare. Their bodies were never found, but in the middle of the patch, the town sheriff discovered 4 freshly carved jack-o'-lanterns, each one bearing the terrified expression of a different face. The town closed off the pumpkin patch after that. No one dared go near it again. But every Halloween, locals swear they can still see him. The Pumpkin Patch Man, standing in the field, his jack-o'-lantern face glowing in the darkness, waiting for his next victim. Each of these tales has been passed down, whispered from one generation to the next, their details shifting with the years, but their core truths remaining the same. Are they just stories, born from the imagination of small towns and superstitious minds? Or are they chilling reminders of the horrors that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the night when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. Halloween